Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Your day's been a tough one, think on this. You were not at least stuck in an EU exit and trade subcommittee for nearly 11 hours in Chequers. Unless, of course, you were one of those and you've just switched on Newsnight to find out what actually happened after you dozed off halfway through. This is the meeting that hopes to finally resolve whether the UK will seek to retain close regulatory alignment with the EU. We're not expecting any details from the PM before Thursday. Mr Corbyn is hoping to pip the PM to the post with an announcement of his own position on Brexit next week. Well, tonight, Emily Thornberry told LBC's Ian Dale that Labour would replicate the customs union post-Brexit. He's here now with the Times columnist Matthew Parris and the director of the Centre for Labour and Social Studies, Faiza Shaheen. A warm welcome to all of you. It played a blinder today. Just tell us what you heard.
Well, Emily Thornberry came in to do a phone-in. Obviously, the customs union is the big thing. We're all expecting Jeremy Corbyn to make some sort of announcement on it on Thursday. So I thought, well, I'm not going to ask her what he's going to say because she won't tell me if I ask her that. So I just said, well, your thinking is developing on the customs union, isn't it, Emily? And she then said, well, absolutely it is, and we don't intend to stay in the customs union, but we're going to have something as near as damn it to it, which would mean that we would not be able to negotiate our own trade agreement. She said that Britain would have a special role with the EU in negotiating these new trade agreements. But, I mean, why the EU would agree to that, I do not know.
Is she going out on a limb? Do you think this is the Corbyn position now?
No, I don't think she is going out on a limb at all. I think this is what Jeremy Corbyn will announce on Monday. And that's going to be quite interesting because 65% of Labour members voted Remain, but that's not the same for Labour voters. And I think there are going to be a lot of Labour voters think, well, hang on a minute, we've heard all of this rhetoric from John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn about we respect the wishes of the British people, blah, blah, blah. Well, staying in the customs union effectively does mean at least partially staying in the EU.
We're just trying to see if there is clear water. Now, Laura Kunsberg, just the last few moments, has said that the UK, the Cabinet has agreed that the UK wants to stick to its standards, but on its own terms. What does that sound like to you?
You're going to ask me. What does that sound like? I mean, we've just heard so much language that has been created to cover up the fact that our government hasn't got a decision on what they're doing and how they're going to do it. And I'm sure I'm not the only person frustrated. We're having business lobbies coming up with their own plans in the meantime. You know, that to me is like, well, we might have some divergence, we might not. We might have to look again about what we do with the Northern Ireland border, but that's not in any way any clarity, is it?
But it is a breakthrough of unity. This is what Laura certainly is hearing tonight. Do you feel, Matthew, from just the snippets that are coming out, that the Cabinet has got to a place now where they can look each other in the eye and say, we're united?
No. You know that they couldn't have because we know that they're split among themselves. They have very different opinions. There is no way that Philip Hammond can look Liam Fox in the eye and say, we're united. I think we have to treat these early rumours with some caution. You know those dreams you have where you're about to take an exam and you haven't even read the syllabus? I think Mrs May probably has this nightmare that she's about to announce a Brexit plan and she hasn't got one.
What do you think they're doing then for you know, all this time, from sort of lunch onwards until I think it's just broken up now, the last half hour? What are they doing if
Just repeat that phrase again that Laura said, that they've agreed what?
From what I understand, they have agreed, a breakthrough of unity in the Cabinet for now. This is according to one minister.
Well, James Forsyth, from the political editor of The Spectator, is reporting that they've agreed on divergence. Now, if that is the case... well, if that is the case...
What, you mean divergence within the Cabinet?
No. Divergence from EU regulations,
right.
as you well know, Emily. Now, if that is the case, that will be seen as a breakthrough for the Prime Minister, because she will have got Philip Hammond and Amber Rudd and whoever else, David Lidington, on side. I have my doubts as to whether that's necessarily the case, because I think that Matthew is right. There is this split within the Cabinet. Now, the Brexiteers, I think, slightly have the upper hand, and I don't think that Liam Fox, Boris Johnson, possibly to a lesser extent David Davis, could live with a situation where there was going to be more or less full regulatory alignment. Now, there will be alignment on a lot of things. In particular industries, it is in our interest to keep some sort of alignment, but we've got to have the freedom not to do that.
Just hearing that a source has told Laura that divergence has won, right? Divergence has won. So you're now cheering, if this is right.
Well, I don't see the point of leaving the EU if you're just going to obey all the rules in perpetuity without any say in how they're adopted. Now, it may be that in some industries we do mirror EU regulations. So I'm not saying that we have to be completely divergent, but we have to judge it on a case-by-case basis.
I mean, this would then be clear water. If Corbyn, Emily Thornberry, John McDonnell are going to come out next week and say, we think there is now a change of heart or a change of policy for Labour, do you think that's where we're going to get to?
Look, the big thing is then what does that mean for the Northern Ireland border when you have divergence? And this has been the whole problem of the last year. We seem to be going at this the wrong way and making this more about politics rather than thinking about what this means for people, and in particular about that border. Like, let's start with what can you do there? Because that is ultimately, we have this conversation and then you come all the way back round and go, but Northern Ireland, we can't do that.
I think it's because people on, and I don't want to put words into Matthew's mouth, but I will anyway, I mean, people on the Remain side of the argument are viewing this as an insoluble problem. It isn't insoluble. When you've got the Irish government who don't want a border, the British government don't want a border, the EU doesn't want to have a border. So
what requires a border.
No, it doesn't, because what will happen...
Well, let Matthew put the words into his own mouth then.
There will be a bespoke customs arrangement to make sure that
does that work?
Lovely, lovely phrases, bespoke customs arrangement, deep and special partnership. They're all just words. The question is, are we going to get a hard Brexit or a soft Brexit? If what you've heard is true, it's going to be a fairly hard Brexit. In that case, I think there's a majority in the House of Commons with all the Labour Party, if they will go for customs union, as now seems likely, and 50 or 60 members of the Conservative Party, you actually have a majority for blocking this.
OK, so you now trust that Corbyn will go one way, with the support probably of the SNP, of the devolved nations, of the Lords probably as well. Can a May government survive that?
I don't think so, no. No, there is no majority in Parliament for that outcome, and I don't see how a May government could survive.
And as a Remainer Conservative, how would you vote if it came to an election then?
A general election?
Yeah.
I couldn't vote for Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister. I stay in the Conservative Party so I can vote against either Boris Johnson or Jacob Rees-Mogg ever becoming leader of the party. But you wouldn't think,
if it came to it, it was more important to give your Remainer vote to Corbyn if he was aligned with the customs union?
I would be very torn. I suppose loyalty to the old tribe would prevail, but there will be millions of people for whom it won't.
Faiza, we've seen a lot of people get up to the brink, make the speeches, do the words, and then they sort of run away, they bottle it. We don't actually hear anyone change your position or clarifying a position at all. Do you actually think this is the week, next week is the week, that we're going to hear a defined new Labour position in your heart?
Look, things are moving and we are coming to a point where a lot of people are frustrated and are saying, look, we're getting to that 1 year since we triggered Brexit. How can we not have a plan right now? And businesses are quite rightly saying, we can't go on like this. And we're hearing from workers, we just put out a report, hearing that, you know, in our workspaces, the investment's not being made. You know, our employers are holding back on what they're doing in terms of wages. So we have hit a crunch point. So Labour themselves have to, you know, there's a lot of pressure on them to come up with, you know, a much more solid plan as well. So I do think it has to happen now. And if it doesn't happen, the repercussions for people's lives in this kind of insecure environment, you know, we also found a majority that worry that the economy is a threat to their employment because they just don't know what's happening. So actually, our politicians haven't been doing their job and they need to be rolling out their plans, saying what they're going to do going forward, especially the government in power.
Well, I think you're right. The government do have to say a lot more about what their plans are, and hopefully that's going to... I mean, we expected it 3 months ago. Hopefully we're going to get it from Theresa May next week. But there's been another development tonight where Anna Soubry has put down an amendment to the trade bill calling for a customs union. Now, there aren't 60 members of Parliament, Conservative members of Parliament, who would vote for that, but there are probably a dozen or 15, and that would be enough, in theory, for the government to be defeated. Now, if that happens, you then presumably go to a situation where you have a vote of confidence, because Theresa May cannot possibly allow that to go through, because it undermines her entire strategy, assuming that there is a strategy. So you're right, there could well be some very interesting times when that amendment is
Do you
debated.
think it helps or does it help the Conservatives and Brexiteers if there is a more solid commitment from Labour to the customs union?
It's a difficult one. I mean, I think Labour are in a very cleft stick here with their own supporters and with their own membership. And I mean, Faisal will rightly say that the Conservative Party has its divides on this, but the Labour Party does too. And I don't know. I mean, if there was a general election as a result of this, say Parliament did vote to stay in a customs union or a form of customs union, and Theresa May thought she couldn't carry on that basis. I just don't know how the parties would go into an election.
Is anyone cancelling their holidays?
No.
May, June?
No, I'm not.
And I won't be making any more election predictions either.
We have been conflating two different plans. One is the plan for the transition period, and the other is the plan for after the transition period. And it's quite possible that the Cabinet have agreed that there's going to be divergence after the transition period, but convergence or staying together during it.
I think that's right.
That's probably the...
Do you think Corbyn is now sniffing power? Do you think that's what this is about?
Yeah, and look, the point is, right, the membership in general, the Labour membership supports even staying in the single market. But the big thing, of course, is that if we run the election, what happened last year, the domestic issues really matter, and that's where the Conservative Party has failed massively. You know, and because of Brexit, they've been kicking the can down the road on various different issues. Okay. You know, various different consultations after consultation. So, you know, if there was another general election, Labour can go hard, and they have a different position. If they have a different position, that will help them on Brexit.
We've run out, but thank you all very much indeed, and thanks for coming in.
So Theresa May's Brexit cabinet enjoyed a lavish dinner last night of cream of sweet corn soup with a ham hock croquette, followed by Guinness short rib of Dexter beef with onions and parsnip mash. That's the food. But now the Chequers party is over and the clean-up has begun. We've been told the Prime Minister played a blinder and that there was an outbreak of unity for now. But just what has been agreed? Well, some have briefed that divergence has won, meaning Britain won't be tied to EU regulations, but instead try to trade with Europe using a system of mutually agreed rules. Others have said there was an increasing realisation that there needed to be a pragmatic Brexit, with an acknowledgement that the UK should stick closely to Brussels in some areas. So what now? Well, Theresa May will have to get her whole cabinet to sign off on the deal next Tuesday, before the Prime Minister makes her keynote speech outlining the government's position next Friday. The fun really starts when they put the proposals to the EU. Michel Barnier has already warned that the government's plans would not be compatible with the EU's principles. There are also a few coming late to the party. Tory backbench MP Anna Soubry has put down a new amendment to the government's trade bill, calling for a customs union with the EU once we leave. This could potentially be very dangerous for Mrs May, as it could get support from Labour, who are also poised to commit themselves to membership of a customs union, with a speech from Jeremy Corbyn expected on Monday. Here's what Cabinet Ministers Amber Rudd and Michael Gove had to say about last night's meeting at Chequers as they left home this morning.
It's a very positive meeting. We all got behind the Prime Minister and we've agreed the basis for her speech for next week, and looking forward to it going ahead. Thank you.
No, the Prime Minister is going to be making a speech shortly, but there was a very, very good atmosphere and we agreed on the way forward.
Well, we're joined now from Central Lobby by Dominic Grieve. Welcome to the Daily Politics. Dominic, your colleague Anna Soubry has put down a new amendment to the government's trade bill calling for a customs union with the EU once we leave. Theresa May has said that Britain will be leaving the customs union with the EU. Why have you signed up to it?
The Prime Minister is absolutely right that if we leave the EU, we will leave the customs union with the EU because the one is dependent upon the other. But the question which arises is what is in our national interest for the future to avoid tariffs and inspection regimes and enable free trade and the maintenance of an open border between ourselves and our EU partners and the north and south of Ireland. These are important considerations. And my view has always been that the national interest lies in our maintaining those. And if that means being in a form of customs union, then I don't think that's something that we ought to rule out. Now, of course, the Prime Minister's indicated she would like to try to achieve this ability to have a free flow of trade and goods by some other means. And I don't object to that in any way. But I do have some strong views about eliminating the possibility of a customs union, because at the end of the day, I think the likely benefit to the United Kingdom of third-party agreements with other countries is going to be much, much less than the disadvantage of losing that free flow of trade, which I think will have an adverse impact on our GDP.
Right, as you say, you differ with the Prime Minister as to how this future relationship can be achieved. What difference will this tabled amendment actually make?
Well, just to be correct, I don't differ with her about how it might be achieved. If she can achieve it by the means that she is seeking, all well and good. But we should not rule out the possibility of a customs union. And in order to make sure that that issue remains on the table, that's why this amendment's been tabled. And it will mean that when we come to the report stage of the bill, it can be given proper consideration, particularly in the light of where the negotiations have got to by that stage.
But do you accept that following what has been reported from those who attended the Chequers away day, the great 8-hour marathon meeting, that it was relatively harmonious? And in supporting this amendment, you are going to make life potentially very difficult for your own Prime Minister?
That, I think, is a misunderstanding of the tabling of amendments. As parliamentarians, we can and should table amendments during the course of passages of bills to ensure that issues are considered that we think are of importance. What decision is taken about this amendment must be dependent on what stage and what the information we have as to the progress of negotiations when it comes back. The point is, we should not exclude the possibility of remaining in a customs union. But that is what we have got to make sure that we keep that issue available for us.
But you want to have Labour MPs support this amendment, and in fact you want the Labour leadership to tell its MPs to back this amendment about remaining in a customs union, which could result in defeat for your government.
I've absolutely no idea whether the Labour leadership, which actually is led by somebody who, broadly speaking, has supported Brexit, will wish to support this amendment. I have little doubt that this amendment will command support across the House. I think it may well command support across a broad swathe of the Conservative Party in Parliament as well. But at the moment, we haven't come to that point. This amendment's been tabled and I support it because it's absolutely essential we should keep this issue available and that we should consider it.
Right, but I've looked at the people who have signed up to that amendment, a large number of Labour MPs, and if you listen to anything that has come out of the Labour leadership's mouths over the last few weeks, it does look as if they are moving to confirming that position, which is like yours, keeping the issue of a customs union on the table. So I say again, if the government was defeated, what would happen then?
Well, if the government were defeated eventually on this, then the government would, I would assume, be required to keep us or seek to negotiate keeping us in the customs union, if that, of course, can be obtained from our EU partners. Everything has that, that issue with it as well. Sorry, excuse me.
That's all right.
So, you know, those are things which one has to keep in mind. Of course one does. But I don't think it would be the end of the government at all. There's no reason why it should be.
Right, I mean, you clear your throat just for a moment because I can see you're struggling there. Heather Stewart, let's just quickly ask about Labour, because Jeremy Corbyn is going to make this speech on Monday. Do you think it'll be the point at which Jeremy Corbyn says we will back the idea of Britain remaining in a customs union with the European Union?
Well, there's certainly been a shift in Labour policy and a coordinated one, because we've seen several shadow cabinet members from kind of different wings of the party, as it were, Owen Smith, Emily Thornberry and others saying the policy is evolving. John McDonnell had some interesting words on this yesterday too. I think it's always dangerous to predict precisely what Jeremy Corbyn will say in one of his speeches. I remember heavily trailed speeches during the referendum campaign, which didn't turn out quite as expected. But yeah, there's very clearly been a shift, and obviously the Labour leadership is extremely keen on inflicting a defeat on the government in the House of Commons if it can.
All right, and so on that basis, Tim Stanley, how dangerous is it for Theresa May? I mean, Dominic Grieve, Conservative MP, says, well, it'll just mean that we will have to keep the idea of a customs union, being in a customs union, on the table. It'll mean more than that, won't it, for Theresa May?
But listening to Mr Grieve then, he seemed to leave a door open to the possibility of a Canada +++ type model of a free trade agreement which delivers all the benefits of a customs union without us being in one. I'm sure he'll want to respond to that. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I see that as the kind of compromise that might happen. We've essentially got three separate positions emerging here. We have that of the government, which hasn't really changed, by the way, where they're saying they want divergence. They will copy what the EU does, but they won't be in the EU. You have the Tory rebel and increasingly the Labour position, which hasn't really changed, by the way, of saying we should be in a customs union. One position which might have changed, the Sun is reporting that some members of the EU 27 are actually in favour of a Canada +++ style deal and don't want to see things dragged down too much by the Commission's negotiators. So in many ways, things have not changed, but I don't see this disagreement between the rebels and the government as completely shutting the door on some sort of agreement.
But what would happen if the government was defeated on this amendment?
It would be very embarrassing, yes, and it would completely undermine the government's efforts at providing a unified front, and it might embolden those within the cabinet, such as Philip Hammond, who take a rather more pro-Remain point of view, which I suspect is what's on the rebels' minds. But I do think people like Mr Grieve and Anna Soubry are perfectly reasonable, and I'm sure some accommodation can be reached.
Right, but you are prepared, if it comes to it, Dominic Grieve, to inflict an embarrassing defeat on your own government?
I never want to defeat my own government, and I always seek to try to avoid doing that. And after all, I don't actually have a reputation as a serial rebel,
sure.
even though I voted once on a major national issue against the government.
But you said it was in the national
bill.
interest to keep this on the table. So, I mean, are you prepared to put your principles here ahead of the party?
Well, I think we were just in danger of running ahead of ourselves on this. I've explained what it is that this amendment is designed to achieve. The point was very well made that it may be that, in fact, some Canada +++ arrangement can be arrived at. I'm interested in the reality of free trade without tariffs, without inspection regimes. That's what I want to see. I'm perfectly prepared to consider different options, but I'm not prepared to exclude options in order to achieve that.
Right. What do you say to your colleague Jacob Rees-Mogg, who has said that remaining in a customs union with the EU would mean we would be subject to a common external tariff, meaning higher prices for clothing and footwear, be more expensive for the British public? Does your amendment risk lowering the standard of living for people in this country?
The very reverse. I'm afraid I disagree completely with Jacob's analysis on this. The evidence is overwhelming that if we come out of a customs union, we have no satisfactory arrangements and we have a tariff and inspection regime, the cost of living overall in this country is going to rise, and it's the poorest and most vulnerable who will suffer the most.
Tim Stanley, what do you say to that?
One could argue that, you put it to Mr Grieve, that he was creating trouble for the government. You could argue that, in fact, the Brexiteers are creating trouble for the government by saying, for instance, stop the migration, the right of people to settle during the transition. Everyone is bargaining right now. That's all I can really say. It's up to the Prime Minister to somehow navigate things through. And one reason why she always appears so tight-lipped and so difficult to read is because she's juggling so many balls. You could argue that's her fault because she didn't get the majority she wanted to make all this possible. But this week I feel a little more sympathetic to her because we're starting to see the demands of other people within Parliament, and she's got to keep them all happy while also maintaining a clear path for the government.
Dominic Grieve, thank you.
Thank you.
Now, the leaders of the other 27 EU countries are gathering in Brussels today to, amongst other things, firm up their position on Brexit. And our Brussels reporter, Adam Fleming, is there. Adam, tell me what they're discussing.
So, Joe, the way I've been putting it this morning is that Brexit isn't the theme tune for this summit, but it is the background music, if you like. It sort of runs through lots of things. So they're going to talk about the future composition of the European Parliament after 2019, because there will no longer be 73 British MEPs there. They're going to talk about the successor to the Spitzenkandidat process, by which Jean-Claude Juncker was made president of the European Commission. His term of office is up next year, so how will his successor be chosen? Then they've got the really thorny issue of the MFF, the multi-annual financial framework, which, as we all know, is the 7-year budget cycle for the EU, which will start in 2021. And it will have a Brexit-sized hole in it of potentially 15 billion euros a year. So lots of difficult conversations between net contributors who pay in and don't necessarily want to pay in any more, and net recipients who don't necessarily want to receive any less. while there's increasing demands on the EU's budget when it comes to security and migration. And so that discussion will go on for months and months and months and months. And in terms of Brexit, the only bit actually formally on the agenda today is that Donald Tusk, the President of the Council, will update the 27 leaders on the process that he will go through to write their next set of guidelines for the next phase of talks about trade and the future relationship, which the 27 will sign off in this building when they next meet on the 23rd of March.
Now, Adam, the EU appears to have rejected a key British proposal for the future relationship after Brexit, these so-called baskets, where you could have sort of variants in relations post-Brexit. And this is according to documents that were published by the European Commission. But in your opinion, are the EU 27 still singing from the same hymn sheet? Is there any sign of divergence, to coin a phrase?
Yeah, that's the word we all use all the time, it seems, at the moment.
Very fashionable.
Yes, so that document yesterday that emerged was a presentation that was given by the European Commission Brexit negotiators to the diplomats from the 27 a couple of weeks ago, which talked about this three baskets approach that the Prime Minister has as her basis for the discussion about the future relationship. And they said it was incompatible with the European Council's guidelines for Brexit. And they pointed out that it meant that the UK was cherry-picking, taking what bits of the single market that it liked, which threatened the integrity of the single market. They pointed out that it threatened the autonomy of the EU's decision-making, because it would mean that the UK on the outside would be too involved on decisions happening on the inside. They said there would have to be a role for the European Court of Justice if the UK was still going to rely on concepts in EU law. And they also said, oh, what about Norway, who, because they're in the European Economic Area, might get annoyed about the UK getting this kind of deal. Now, they were very firm. That is against all the guidelines that were drawn up by the 27 in April last year, right at the start of this. But I'm detecting subtle little hints of where things are changing. Now, this is going to sound incredibly geeky, so bear with me. The Swedish Board of Trade, which is the trade agency that advises the Swedish government, has just written a 260-page report about Brexit and its impact on the Swedish economy. It's all in Swedish, but they've released a 4-page summary in English, which says a one-size-fits-all model for the UK and Sweden is not appropriate for the Swedish economy. They say for some sectors of the Swedish economy, it would be best if the UK remained in the EEA. For some sectors of the Swedish economy, it would be better if there was a deep and special trade relationship like the one the EU has with Ukraine. For some parts of the Swedish economy, it would be better to be like Switzerland, where they have loads of bilateral deals about different sectors. And they say a plain free trade agreement like the EU has with Canada or Japan would not eliminate barriers to trade and effectively wouldn't be good enough. Now, to my ears, does that mean they are criticising Michel Barnier's "it's Canada, it's the best you're going to get" approach? Or are they criticising the UK's red lines and saying, well, actually, you're going to have to dilute some of those red lines in some of those areas? Or is it both, or is it neither? And I suppose that's what we're going to be looking for in the next month, more clues about exactly what do the member states think about this future relationship.
Well, Adam, thank you, and thank goodness there was that translation from the Swedish Board of Trade. That would have left you in a bit of a stymie. Now, we're joined from Rome by the Italian MEP Roberto Gualtieri, who is on the European Parliament's Brexit Steering Group. Welcome to the programme. I don't know how much of the last discussion you just heard, but we're already hearing that Brussels is rejecting Theresa May's approach of managed divergence. Why?
Actually, this is not true. We are respectively waiting for understand what is exactly the UK proposal. We understand there will be a speech of the Prime Minister next week, and then we will define our guidelines. We have only said that we want a relationship with the United Kingdom which is as close as possible, but of course any kind of relationship has its own balance of rights and obligation.
Right.
Single market has some rules, a custom union and other rules, and if there are red lines that prevent those solutions, then we enter into the category of a free trade agreement, which of course has to be negotiated.
Right, but you say you don't know what Britain wants and therefore nothing has been rejected. But that's not the case, is it, Roberto? Because the Prime Minister and the government has put forward this proposal of three baskets where you would have some mutual recognition in some areas, some close alignment and some divergence. And we know now from the Commission that they've rejected that. So I say again, why has that been rejected out of hand?
Honestly, again, I don't understand what are we talking about. We have not received the formal position, complete position. We have heard speeches hinting of these baskets, which is not totally clear concept. We know that in a free trade agreement, if UK is not in a custom union, if it's not in a single market, of course we cannot have a totally frictionless trade. Then we have to negotiate a free trade agreement, and the level of market access will depend on a number of factors. We can have a very good level of market access for goods. In services, a bit more difficult. Of course, as the Swedish document that was just quoted says, if in a free trade agreement, it's impossible to have a frictionless trade, because if you want a frictionless trade, you need to stay in the single market, the custom union. But this is, I mean, these are only the basics. Then, of course, we have to enter into the negotiation, and we need a clear position of the UK. And, of course, we will present our guidelines in the Parliament and the European Council in March.
Right, but you do accept that countries, there are a number of countries, in fact, that do have special deals with the European Union. It's not strictly a case of remaining in the single market to get that frictionless trade, or remaining in the customs union so that there is that complete alignment with rules of origin and regulations. For example, Turkey. It isn't bound by freedom of movement and has a customs union with the EU, but only on goods and not services. That's a bespoke deal. So why can't Britain have a bespoke deal?
No, but this is exactly a very good example. Turkey is a member of a custom union, not the Union Custom Union. This has some advantages in terms of tariff. Of course, Turkey is bound to have the same tariff outside, so this means that there's some limitation in its trade policy, but has the benefit of with less friction in the trade of goods. Of course, there are still some checks to be done because Turkey is not in the single market.
Right, but wouldn't that fit broadly with the approach of three baskets? I mean, Norway also has a special deal. It's part of the single market, I'm sorry, but not the customs union. It has separate rules for industries like farm produce and fish. So again, Britain could have a similar approach, mixing perhaps the two.
But that's exactly the reason why we need to wait for what will be the proposal, because something similar to Turkey is different from a free trade agreement, because it implies some limitation in setting the external tariff that, of course, Canada does not have. But so far, we have heard that UK was excluding this option. If it would move in that direction, would be a positive thing, of course, but this has not been said.
Yes, but we keep hearing from the European Union and Michel Barnier that Britain won't be allowed to cherry-pick. But examples of Norway, Turkey and Switzerland, or in Switzerland's case, their bilateral agreements with the EU, to some extent, that is cherry-picking. And this has been rejected out of hand for Britain. Why?
No, I insist to disagree with your description of how we are rejecting things. It's not true.
But the EU Commission has rejected it.
Turkey is a clear case which has some balance of right and obligation. If the UK chooses to be bound by a custom union, in some element, is a positive factor. We are not rejecting at all. Switzerland is a bit different, but I would like to remind that Switzerland has the freedom of movement, that the fourth freedom is applies with Switzerland. I understand that the UK does not want this.
Is the EU 27 still unified?
Absolutely. I think we have been unified, and we will be united because we have a very reasonable position. We want a relationship as close as possible with the United Kingdom. Of course, each kind of relationship has its balance of right and obligation, and we have to respect this principle. So we are open to engage in negotiation as far as the UK will have a clear position, a clear proposal, and we will discuss. It would be also very useful, of course, to conclude quickly the discussion on the transition, because that's also an element of certainty. We are close, not yet there. I hope that a number of points that are still open, will be positively solved, and the very reasonable proposal of the European Union, with some adaptation, of course, it could be the basis of an agreement, so we could move to this last phase, which is crucial, of course.
OK, Roberto, just stay with us while I bring my other guests into the discussion. Tim Stanley, what do you make of what Roberto Gualtieri is saying, despite some of the language that has come from the European Union about not wanting Britain to cherry-pick? Does he have a point that it's still not clear exactly what Britain is after?
That's very true, but it's also, obviously from what he said, not entirely clear what Europe will eventually agree to. I'm loving this discussion this morning because we're seeing some light at the end of the tunnel. At the beginning of the negotiating process, everything tended to feel like it was on the side of the EU because they were trying to get as much money out of us. That was their focus at the beginning of the process.
And they've got that.
Because as you heard, and they've got it, because as you've heard with us gone, they're down something like 8 or 9 billion. But now that we're moving on, while the Commission may well be saying one thing, Michel Barnier may be saying one thing, which is divergence is not possible, you can't cherry pick, which technically speaking is true from the EU's point of view. Interesting to hear that the individual representatives from different countries are all thinking, hang on, we sell to Britain's markets. They're thinking, well, why can't we do a deal? Because it's in everyone's benefit.
What do you think about the idea of Britain's sort of managed divergence, which I'm sure can mean something to everyone in terms of sort of semantics and linguistic gymnastics? Do you think Britain is going to find it much more difficult once this is presented to the EU?
I do, and I think it's a better wheeze for dealing with the divergence within the Cabinet itself, rather than with thinking about the negotiations, although it seemed to me there was a bit of a chink of light in the sense of, you know, when you raised Turkey, the answer was, yes, well, they do have a customs union in particular areas. And so that does seem to open up the idea of different arrangements in different sectors, which, you know, Theresa May many months ago used to say repeatedly, the customs union is not a binary question, you know, to which the Commission used to say, absolutely, yes, it is. But, you know, perhaps it is a bit more complex than that. And this is why David Davis and other ministers are shuttling around like mad, visiting, you know, several European capitals every week, because they very much hope to open up a little bit of a chink between Brussels and the EU27.
On the transition, the implementation period, which Roberto Gualtieri mentioned, do you think it is now becoming clear that Theresa May will have to give way on her proposal to change the rights for EU citizens coming during that two-year period?
It's implicit in that the transition deal still doesn't feel that it's been nailed down. And the Times, of course, was reporting today that that's exactly what would happen. I think what Britain wants to maintain at this stage is as much flexibility as possible, because it's got to get its house in order, but also it doesn't want to put too much of a time limit on negotiations when it comes to discussing that future trade deal. So my view is that regardless of what the government may publicly say about rights or Ireland or any of this stuff, my suspicion is the transition is still going to be a movable feast.
Roberto Gualtieri, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
European Union leaders are meeting in Brussels without Theresa May to discuss the EU's future after Brexit. Theresa May will give more details on how close a relationship Britain should eventually have with the EU in a speech next Friday. Well, our Europe correspondent Damien Grammaticus is at the EU summit in Brussels. So what can you tell us, Damien, about what the leaders have been discussing today?
Fiona, we're just getting the details of the outcome of that. The press conferences are happening right now. On the table were some difficult issues that they will be facing. Number one, the hole in the budget left when the UK leaves. That's going to be about 10% of the EU's budget. And there are divisions there. The countries that put money in, many of them say they don't want to put more in. The countries that tend to receive money, they don't want to receive less. Well, Donald Tusk has just been saying that quite a number of countries have indicated a willingness to spend more, and on priorities like stemming illegal migration and on defence and security. So perhaps some progress there. He's also said that it seems there's an agreement on the UK's MEPs that will be vanishing. Those seats will disappear. We carved up some of them amongst other countries. On the crucial issue of the Brexit negotiations, the leaders here are all waiting to hear the outcome of the cabinet discussions at Chequers. Now, the indications are that the UK will try to ask for a trade deal with added extras, special access for some areas, some businesses like automobiles. The Irish Prime Minister today pouring cold water in that idea, saying you can't have special access in some areas, and the EU has already made clear it's not keen on that idea. But Donald Tusk has said He is going to London on Thursday next week ahead of Theresa May's big speech. He needs details and says he will press ahead with the EU's plans and its guidelines, whether the UK is ready or not.
Damien in Brussels, thank you.
Former Prime Minister Tony Blair says there should be a second EU referendum if MPs defeat Theresa May's Brexit plans. It comes as a growing list of Conservatives threaten to rebel over plans to pull Britain out of any kind of customs union. Well, our political correspondent Paul Brown joins me live now from Westminster. So, Paul, more pressure on the government ahead of what's a crucial week.
Yeah, Alistair, both Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn due to make major speeches on Brexit next week, and for once, some might say, we expect the content of those speeches to be radically different, potentially. And now the question is whose vision of Brexit is going to win out. Today we heard from about half a dozen Conservative MPs saying they are potentially willing to join forces with Labour to force the Prime Minister to keep us inside a customs union when we leave the EU, meaning that she could face defeat here in Parliament as early as the spring. And this morning, the former Labour Prime Minister Tony Blair said to me, if that happens, that could be the point for a general election or potentially a second referendum.
If you can't make an agreement in Parliament, because there literally is just not consent for whatever of these versions of Brexit you want, then I think you've got to find some way of bringing it back so that people can have a final say on the final deal.
But at least the Cabinet are all on the same page right now. We're told at Chequers yesterday they agreed that we would align rules and regulations with the EU when it suits Britain, though just now in a press conference the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, said that that is pure illusion, and therein lies Theresa May's constant conflict. How to keep party, Parliament and players in Europe all happy at once.
Paul, thank you.
I've been